Let's explore how to use the debugging features in Management Studio in order to step through the code in the Insert Shipper Results Stored procedure. And then we can use that in order to examine the value of variables. So the first thing I want to do is set a breakpoint on the statement that invokes that stored procedure. And the easiest way to do that is to just click out here in the gray margin, and that puts that red ball there and gives a background of red. So what's going to happen is when I execute the code, execution is going to pause on this statement, and that'll allow me to step into that stored procedure. All right, so I want to execute the code, so I'm going to highlight those statements. And then, in order to execute it, I want to use the debug option here. I don't want to use execute because that won't attach the debugger to Management Studio. So I want to use debug. I can also use debug and start debugging. Either way is fine. Okay, so I'll click on debug, and that opens up this debugging window. And I'm now in debug mode. And as you can see, Management Studio has opened up a few other windows that give me insight into the code as it executes. Also notice that I have a yellow arrow right here that indicates the next statement that is going to be executed. And the statement is highlighted in yellow. Now, by the way, when you click on the debug button, you might get a warning that says something about unable to start T-SQL debugging. Could not connect to computer, whatever. The debugger cannot connect to the remote computer, which doesn't really make any sense because I'm connected to the local machine here, but you get this error anyway. This may be because the remote computer, I'm still quoting from the message box you may get, this may be because the remote computer does not exist or a firewall may be preventing communication to the remote computer. Please see help for assistance. And there'll be a help button and an OK button. So that can be a little bit misleading. The problem is that if you open Management Studio and connect it using local as a server name, you know that you can enter server name as open parentheses, local, close parentheses, then you can try changing the connection to use the local machine name, Floyd or whatever the local machine name is. So it's just that sometimes Management Studio gets confused when I make a connection using local. But if you use the machine name, it should avoid that problem. So just be aware that if you have a weird dialog box like that pops up when you try to debug, that's probably the issue. If not, you'll definitely want to check out the help topic to see what else might be a problem. Okay, so at this point, if you've done any code using Visual Studio, the debugging features are going to be fairly familiar because I can step into the code. And there's different icons up here, step into, step over, or step out. So step into is the one I want to use because I want to step into the code of Insert Shipper Results. If I didn't want to, if I had highlighted multiple lines of code here, then I could step over this one if I was more interested in debugging a later stored procedure or function or whatever that I'm executing. And once I've stepped into something, I can execute all of the rest of the code within that function or stored procedure or whatever, and go back to the invoking code by selecting this button here. And so as you can see, the little tooltip says step out. And there's F keys, function keys, that are shortcuts for each of those. Okay, so when I step into, click into that, notice I get a new window, new debugging window, that opens up the source code for that stored procedure. So I end up with a different tab for each of the code modules that I'm debugging. So if this stored procedure then called another one, which called another one, which called another one, which then called a function, and so forth, then you might have multiple tabs open as you drill down into the call stack. And you can look at your current location in the call stack down here in this window right here. Okay, so as far as the other windows that appear, this locals is a very handy one because this is going to show you all of the variables that are local to the current code module that I'm looking at, in this case the Insert Shipper Results stored procedure, and provides the current value as well as the type. And so I can go in here, and there's various debugging helps in here. I can use a text visualizer if this is a long line of code. If you use Visual Studio a lot, you can see that this is a feature that is part of Visual Studio. and various other debugging features there. All right, talked about the call stack. If I want to flip around to different locations, I can double click on each of those. And the one that has the next statement that's going to execute is always identified with this yellow arrow. I can look at the breakpoints that I have set. I only have a single one set. I can disable it if I want to or re-enable it. If I want to execute individual commands, I can use the command window or the immediate window, and I can also look at output. Okay, so you have a lot of information that you can use in order to view the current state of the code as you execute it. And most importantly, for stored procedures and functions and other transact SQL code, is going to be the value of the local variables at this point in the code execution. All right, so once I've looked at what I need to, I can step into a couple more lines of code. I can check the logic, make sure that based on the value of company name or any other parameters, it's executing the correct path through the code and so forth. And then when I'm ready to continue, I'm done debugging, I just want to run through all the rest of the code, I can just click on this continue button here, and that will execute that highlighted code to completion. And as you can see, I now have a new shipper ID of 7. And one note about the debugging window is that the windows that you actually see are going to depend upon how you've configured Management Studio. Right now, I'm using pretty much a pristine installation of Management Studio. But if you've opened and closed other windows in the debugger window and so forth, then that state is generally going to be preserved between debugging sessions. So you can configure that. Because Management Studio is built on Visual Studio, the configuration options are nearly infinite. But the nice thing is that the debugging features in Management Studio provide some very powerful ways to test and debug complex stored procedures and other code. You can do the same sort of thing with user-defined functions and so forth. But there are other ways to get information about code as it's running that can help you solve various kinds of problems with your code. And one of those options is print statements. This is kind of an old technique. It was the only one available in older versions of Visual Studio. But they're still a very handy technique for looking at the state of variables and other factors as code executes. Okay, so here's an example. Let me close the result window. Here's an example of creating a procedure that provides debugging through print statements. And what the print statements are doing is that it's displaying the initial variable values, and that's going to be displayed within the messages pane, as well as messages indicating which branches of the stored procedure executed as it executes. So the nice thing about this technique is that you can use it and not have to worry about stepping through the code individually. If you want like a record so that you can see how the code executed through conditionals and loops and so forth, then you can use this technique, and it's really handy to get essentially a picture of how the stored procedure executed. Okay, so I will create that stored procedure. And as you can see, it's essentially another variation of the insert shipper. So we have an output parameter, a couple input parameters, going to test for null, and going to set shipper ID to 0 and print something to that effect. Otherwise, print something that indicates the new shipper ID. Okay, so here's code that executes the stored procedure. Once again, is declaring this new shipper ID variable, and that's going to get the value of that output parameter. So all of this is pretty much the same as the previous version of insert shipper. And then I'm also going to use another print statement here in order to print out that retrieved value. So I'll go ahead and execute that. And there you can see all of the output from those multiple print statements. So you can see the initial values of variables. If you want to, you can trace how they change during the course of execution if your code updates the value of variables and so forth. And then this value was printed from within the stored procedure, and that's printed from outside of the stored procedure from the calling code. And so one of the things you can do is that if those numbers are different, then you have some sort of fundamental logic problem within your stored procedure. It's getting overwritten or not properly initialized or something like that. So you can identify problems using this kind of a technique. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that print statements in your code are returned as informational messages to client applications. And this may or may not be a good thing. So you may or may not want to remove those statements before using the procedure on a production server. So it just depends on how you're using the print statements and whether you want client applications to see what's being printed from those statements. All right, so as you can see, inserting print statements into the body of the stored procedure is a handy technique, but it can be cumbersome. Most of the time, as I mentioned, you're going to want to remove those before deploying the stored procedure. An alternative, though, that lets you avoid using print statements is to incorporate variables into the logic of your stored procedure, returning results to the calling procedure as additional output parameters. And that's what this next sample stored procedure does. Okay, so another variation on insert shipper. And what's happening is that I've included a couple of additional output parameters, return code and return message. And this is just one of many patterns that you can use for this technique. So return code returns an integer value. Return message returns a string. The default values are, within the code here, set to 0 and the empty string. And then each execution path through the code sets different values there. So if company name is null, then the return message is going to say shipper is null. And it's going to leave the return code to 0. Otherwise, if I insert the shipper, I'm going to grab the error message, the number of rows, and then if error is 0 and rows are greater than 0, then we can identify and say that the input was a success. Set the shipper ID to the new ID value, that's that scope identity return value. Provide the number of rows, and then return message set to success. Otherwise, if anything goes wrong, then error number will be non-zero, and rows is probably going to be 0. Then I can set return message to a message that says error equals, provide the error message. And if this is null for any reason, then return a generic no number for this error. Okay, so you can see this code is getting a little bit more complex, but you have a lot more flexibility in how in a complex stored procedure you can return different states about whether the code executed or not. And then the calling code can then take action. If it turns out that the return code is 0, well, then the client code can say, well, what happened? And look at the message and display the message to the user or whatever the client application has to do to recover from that problem. Okay, so I'll go ahead and create the stored procedure. And it was created successfully. Now we need to take a look at how we can use that stored procedure. So this first set of code is going to test it with valid inputs. You should test it both with valid and invalid inputs because you get different results based on it. All right, so here I'm declaring a new shipper ID, same as I've been doing in previous versions of this stored procedure. And then I'm going to get a return value and then a message. So then I execute the stored procedure, supply any input parameters, and then I want to assign those output parameters to those different variables that I declared. As you can see, new shipper ID will again return the shipper ID if a new record was inserted. And then I'll get a return code and a return message. And then I simply select that information in order to display it. So I'll go ahead and execute that. So now we get shipper ID is 9, so that's the new shipper that was inserted. A return value of 1, which in this context means success. Now, you can define the meaning of the return values, those numbers that you provide, any way you want. Maybe 1 is success, maybe 1 is failure. Maybe 0 is success, maybe 0 is failure. You can use negative numbers, whatever makes sense within the context of your application. Okay, so that shows you how you can test it with valid data. But now, let's use an invalid company name. So specifically, setting company name to null. All right. Overall, the execution is the same. I still need those 3 variables. Execute the code all the same way, and then return the data. And I execute that. As you can see, the shipper ID is null, the return value is 0, and it gives me a message about exactly what the problem is.